Who would have thought that Rushcutters Bay had such a history? The indigenous people of the area used it to fish and gather molluscs and oysters. It was very wet because the hills that came down from Paddington brought all the water down. So, what to do with it after settlement? It was too wet to build anything there, but the industrious Chinese who arrived for the gold rush, and after the gold rush petered out at the end of the 1860s, they established what really became Sydney's fruit and vegetable markets. It was our fruit and vegetable basket, and for years the Chinese grew all sorts of things from melons to vegetables, all sorts of fruits, and they'd take them into the Sydney markets. They did have a bit of a problem with the Woolloomooloo and the Rocks larrikins. The gangs used to come and raid the Chinese gardens, throw rocks on their houses. It was an unfortunate time. After the Chinese moved out, what to do with the land? Well, around the beginning of the 20th century, after Federation, in 1908, a World Heavyweight Boxing Championship was staged at what was described as the Rushcutters Bay Stadium. The stadium, in fact, was just a raised area or a mounded area surrounded by barricades that fitted 20,000 people. That's how many people came to watch the fight between Burns and Johnson. Johnson was the big black American boxer, the first coloured person allowed to participate in a boxing world championship. He won. There were about 5,000 people couldn't get into the enclosed area. Mr. McIntosh, who was the promoter, made so much money out of this fight, he built, a few years later, the Rushcutters Bay Stadium, which we all used to call the old tin shed. It was quite an edifice. The thing that fascinated me was the establishment in 1912 of what was called the White City. We always think it was the tennis courts they were referring to. No, there was actually a white city built on about 7 acres of land where the fight had been. It was an amusement park, a gigantic amusement park. With Australia's first scenic railway that wound around snow-topped mountains. That's where the White City's name came from. It had a Japanese pavilion, it had a dance pavilion with their own orchestra, it had lots of walkways, it had lots of fun rides, including a underground riverboat ride, including an underground riverboat ride that had dioramas of early Sydney. Would have liked to have seen that. One of the attractions, apart from the tightrope walkers, the magicians, the karate exhibitions, was a Swedish diver, a famous woman who would, every Saturday night, they would build during the day this tower, quite high, of wood and paper, and she would stand at the top, and the band would play, and she would, at the right drum roll, dive from the very top of the tower into a relatively small container of water. She was the Swedish diver that just fascinated Sydney's media. The other thing I like about the area is that next door to the White City, which closed, by the way, in 1916, it was interrupted by the World War One, and by the time the war finished, jazz music had become popular and dancing, and the fashion for amusement parks like Wonderland at Tamarama or Coogee Aquarium was fading, and they shut their doors of the White City. But it must have been quite a treat. You know, the entrance was where the car wash is down at Rushcutters Bay, and the gates, which were quite grand, had over 5,000 coloured lights. People hadn't seen coloured lights before, so they came from all over Australia to look at the White City gates. The other thing that next door was the Commonwealth roller skating rink, the biggest in Sydney. It had its own band, so on the weekends you would find that thousands of people would be walking up from the city, up William Street, up and then down Bayswater Road, or they'd catch the tram, which they were sensible, and they would either go to the roller skating rink or to the White City. People came in the day as well, because in those times, in 1908, Mr. Farmer opened his swimming pool down at Rushcutters Bay, and it was so popular, Farmer's Baths, as it was called, that he built another one just a little bit further around the bay, which were for women only. But then he shocked Sydney a couple of years later by announcing mixed bathing at 5:30 onwards on Sunday nights. Well, that was the end of it. People just demanded mixed bathing from there on. So Rushcutters Bay, lots of stories. It even had the Cine Sound Studios where Dad and Dave, the feature film, was made. Later on, when all these amusements closed, it became a desirable place for housing, and we saw lots of motor garages and mechanics set up in Rushcutters Bay, and then slowly and surely housing took over, and that's the Rushcutters Bay we know today.